Hello, this is Mark Sobel, U.S. Chair ONFIF. I'm delighted and honored to be joined today by Daleep Singh, Deputy National Security Advisor for the United States and our G Sherpa. Daleep has had an extraordinary career prior to his White House job, working in the private sector at the U.S. Treasury, directing the markets room, overseeing European relations and domestic debt management. And he also served in a highly consequential stint at the New York Fed as executive vice president and head of the markets group during the pandemic, in which he played a major role in quelling highly disrupted global financial markets. And as you can see, he has achieved this despite his relative youth. I'm going to ask Daleep a few questions for the first hour and then turn it over to the audience for the questions. Questions can be submitted in the chat box. Today's event is on the record. Welcome, Daleep.
Nice to be with you, Mark. I don't feel so young.
Been a long week, huh? The president just attended the APEC leaders meeting and the G20 summit. I'm sure he held many bilaterals as well, including with President Xi. I saw a picture of you at the end of the table. So what were your objectives going into the meetings? What was achieved?
Yeah, well, Mark, to state the obvious, our political capital to drive outcomes at multilateral gatherings right now is not overflowing. But a core premise of foreign policy during our term has been that alliances they're an asymmetric advantage for the United States. And multilateral engagement, it's a force multiplier for our interests. And the biggest risks to peace and prosperity cannot and should not be solved alone. So our mindset on this trip was, let's do our job. Let's put the next team in the best possible position to carry forward any lines of effort that they choose to do so. And you mentioned the bilateral with President Xi at APEC. That was the main event. This was the third meeting between President Biden and President Xi during the past 4 years. And here the purpose was to reinforce open lines of communication and stability during the transition, which can sometimes get turbulent in our political cycles. I'd say both presidents also had a chance to reinforce our strategic intent and our strategic perceptions. For example, from our standpoint, that we're not seeking to engage in conflict with China. We're not looking to hold back China's development, but we do insist on fair economic competition, and China becoming the factory to Russia's war machine does threaten our core security interests, and so we'll act accordingly. Towards the end of the discussion, it was really interesting. Both presidents put away their notes, and they really just took stock of their relationship, which goes way back. The dozens of hours they've spent together, and just reflecting on the importance of developing trust and mutual respect. One tangible byproduct from the meeting that I should note, and no one should underestimate, there was an agreement that any decision to use nuclear weapons should be made by humans, not AI. At the G20, we knew it would be difficult to forge consensus around our priorities, but we went out swinging on debt and development in particular, because in my view, if the United States wants to sustain and strengthen global leadership, we need to offer a better value proposition for developing countries that's centered around positive sum economics. And giving lofty speeches about democratic values, that's not going to persuade geopolitical swing states or developing countries. What they're looking for is an unsentimental laydown of a plan that can help liquidity-constrained, debt-burdened countries follow the same growth strategy that we have since the pandemic. So we proposed a three-part commitment that could be made by G20 leaders. Number one, for the IFIs to provide ambitious financing and adjusted DSAs for countries that have ambitious reform and investment plans. Number two, all bilateral creditors should commit to net positive financial flows during the period of adjustment for countries that are willing to make ambitious reform and investment plans. And then three, let's make better use of bilateral tools, multilateral tools to induce the private sector to stay invested on sustainable terms without causing credit rating downgrades. As a complementary step, we highlighted the importance of IDA. It's the single, you know it better than anyone, Mark. It's the single largest source of concessional financing for low-income countries. It's also tremendous bang for the taxpayer's buck. So we announced our pledge. It's $4 billion for the upcoming replenishment. We lobbied others to step up as well. But I would say on the entire debt and development push, and more broadly on our climate objectives, our health security objectives, we made incremental progress. That's the truth. The world is now hedging its bets. The G20 doesn't know if America will continue to lead at the table. And honestly, it's a shame because these cross-border challenges are only going to get larger. I think you're muted, Mark.
So thank you for that. We'll come back to a few of those themes later. So well, let me ask just a question about the G20. It's changed a lot since the leaders first met in 2008. We tried to make it the premier forum for international economic cooperation at Pittsburgh in 2009, but conditions have changed over the last decade. Many emerging markets haven't performed all that well. Putin invaded Crimea in 2014, barbaric war against Ukraine. U.S.-China relations are tense. The U.S. isn't seen as internationalist as before. So, and the G20 has become a cast of thousands, to be honest. So while the G7 doesn't have the macro heft to steer the global economy, it has become a good group, informal grouping for cohesive, democratic, like-minded countries to pursue financial sanctions, cybersecurity, etc. So how do you think about the roles of the G7 and the G20 at this time? And can the G20 be made more effective and go somewhat back to being a more effective body?
I agree with what you said, Mark. I mean, there are 54 countries around the, not countries, leaders at the table at the G20. I mean, the countries, yes, and then the permanent members, but then also 18 guest countries, 16 international organizations. That's quite unwieldy. So look, your framing is right. The geometry of multilateralism, it's reshaping. And I think it's a derivative of a geopolitical backdrop that's in flux. We're no longer in the post-Cold War unipolar moment that underpinned the great moderation of the global economy for almost 30 years. We know that. I think it's too early to say what new regime will evolve, what's going to be the new equilibrium. I think it depends very much on whether the US stays engaged on the world stage with a positive sum vision or whether it retreats into a zero-sum transactional mindset. What I can say is that during our term, and you alluded to it, the G7 became much more than a talk shop. It was a place where we could take collective action forcefully, immediately, on matters of national security, to be sure, but also increasingly on matters of economic security. I would trace it back to the Cornwall summit in 2021. I was in the room, I watched over the course of that gathering, but then afterwards, we gained trust with each other by doing hard things. That's the currency of diplomacy. And it wasn't President Biden saying America is back. It was the doing. So that meant sharing 1 billion vaccines during the most acute phase of the pandemic with the countries most in need with no strings attached. That wasn't easy. Neither was settling a 17-year tariff dispute between Boeing and Airbus, or surging US LNG to Europe before Russia's invasion, or agreeing to end the overseas financing of coal projects. And then everybody remembers the collective freezing of Russia's central bank assets only 2 days after Russia's invasion in 2022, and then agreeing this year to harness $50 billion of value from those assets to fund Ukraine's fight. None of those were easy choices. Each of them increased the trust among G7 leaders, and we're leaving the group in a very good place. If anything, I think it's ripe for expansion, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, which we can come back to. Now, the G20, it's just a more challenging grouping. Some say, especially in the aftermath of what they just observed, that it's become a spectacle. But I mean, no doubt it's the testing ground for whether countries representing 80% of the world's GDP and 2/3 of the world's population can still muster enough cross-border cooperation, even in an era of intensified geopolitical competition, to deal with cross-border challenges like pandemic prevention or financial stability or energy and food insecurity or debt distress or migration. The alternative, if we can't make the G20 functional, it's going to be a collection of smaller blocks with more frictions and less capacity to produce global public goods, even during crisis. And that would be a very bad outcome. So, look, I'd argue the G20 market's never been more important, but it's true, it's also never been less functional since its founding. And that speaks to the opportunity for the United States during its host year, which is 2026. That will mark the beginning of the second cycle of G20 presidencies. And it's a chance to recalibrate how does the G20, how can it work best, and what will it do? I'd say, and this may sound counterintuitive, but I think we need a reductive strategy. And you could base it on two principles. Number one, prioritization. So the G20 should just identify what are the 3 to 5 deliverables at most where cooperation between G20 economies it's necessary, or where the G20 is uniquely placed to address cross-border risks. And then two, even if we can't produce a deliverable, find the areas where communication still has real value. So leave space for dialogue among leaders on geopolitical developments that are threatening global peace and security and macroeconomic stability, for example, even when a tangible byproduct is unlikely. If you just focus on those two principles, I think you would reduce the number of ministerial working groups to the like low to mid single digits. The communique could get streamlined, and we would have a less ambitious but much more functional G20.
Well, having gone through the first cycle of G20 leaders' preparations, I know what a nightmare it can be. Glad I'm not doing the second, but I totally agree with you on streamlining, keeping the meetings focused. And even if you don't achieve anything, it's still useful for leaders to get together, and it's also useful to keep the machinery in place for when you're going to need it, as we inevitably find out. So totally agree with you there. Okay, so economic statecraft, this is a term of art that wasn't frequently heard in my era, but many concepts get swept into the fold for the purpose of protecting national security, such as smart financial sanctions, supply chain resilience, industrial policy, safeguarding advanced technologies. Now, there's much greater recognition and acceptance that one can't pursue economic efficiency for itself, and one has to be very mindful of achieving national security objectives and protecting security. But industrial policy can easily turn into protectionism. So, what guardrails are needed to keep the yard truly small and not devolve into protectionism?
Yeah, again, I agree with the premise of the question. Economic tools are now being used by major powers across the world, not just the US, with unprecedented frequency and potency to advance national security objectives. That's the world we live in. And why? I'd say necessity and opportunity. Necessity because global leadership is now being contested. Both Russia and China have expressed and revealed a desire to upend the US-led international order. If you want to reference Chinese political discourse, to cause great changes unseen in a century. And both Russia and China and others have the capacity to disrupt the US-led order in different ways. And because today's great powers are nuclear powers, barring catastrophic miscalculation, direct conflict with our strategic adversaries, I'd say it's less likely to play out on the battlefield than in the theater of economics and technology and energy. And indeed, that's the premise of Made in China 2025, to create geopolitical leverage by dominating key economic sectors. It's also implicit in the policy of military-civil fusion, which means unfettered diffusion of our most sensitive technologies to China's commercial sector. That would be equivalent to doing so for China's military as well. So that's why using economic tools to advance national security objectives, that's why it's necessary. But I also think they're being used with greater frequency and potency because of opportunity. We're no longer in the era of hyper-globalization, but we're still nearly as connected as ever through trade and capital and technology linkages. Just look at global imports plus global exports as a share of global GDP. We're not far from the peak levels. And that means countries still have plenty of opportunity to break economic linkages or to threaten doing so to gain geopolitical advantage. So I think that explains why we are where we are. But to be clear, I think all of this is regrettable. This is not the world as it should be. It is the world as it is, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. And so, to your question, my strong feeling, and I've been on the record on this several times, is that if we accept that economic statecraft is now a fixture of foreign policy, then we need to articulate a doctrine of economic statecraft that sets out guiding principles for why, how, when, to what extent we use economic tools to advance national security objectives. I think it would also call for an analytical infrastructure that's fit for purpose. One that has the multidisciplinary expertise across economics and financial markets and law and diplomacy to take these tools seriously, to really analyze the efficacy of these tools, their limitations, their spillovers, the lessons we've learned. And also, it would have the horsepower to simulate and stress test how might these tools play out if we're in a multi-stage, multiplayer contest that's going to play out over decades. And then restrain us, ask the question, are we surpassing a threshold of efficacy if we use these tools relative to the next best policy alternative? I think we need to have much more connective tissue with the private sector, with the regulatory community to improve our coordination, to improve the transparency of using these tools. And then ultimately, it needs to kick off, and we have started this, a genuine conversation with allies and partners and really adversaries too, to set out the global rules of engagement. And look, my ultimate aspiration is that we're able to promote better balance in how we use economic tools. Everybody knows about the restrictive ones. They get plenty of ink, sanctions and export controls and tariffs and investment restrictions and price caps and on and on and on. But there's an entire other end of the spectrum of economic tools, the positive tools, debt relief and infrastructure financing and concessional lending, supply chain partnerships, trade agreements, for goodness sakes. Those tools, I would argue, are far more potent in terms of reinforcing American economic leadership. And we should be deliberate about the balance that we strike. And I would say we should convey a standing preference for using the affirmative tools if we are to advance our strategic interests. Now, Mark, you asked questions around small yard, high fence, and those questions come in different forms. And I haven't really answered your question, like, where is the bright line? And I would just say that it's because there are no easy answers. I could say we should only use tariffs for strategic sectors when it's plausible that we could produce substitutes domestically or source them from third countries without causing supply chain disruptions, and when the prospect of uncontrolled retaliation or getting those tariffs offset by a currency adjustment is low. I could say that. And I can also make a similar type of argument in terms of a limiting principle for export controls. Focus on controls for technologies that are truly foundational to national security, where we're likely to have a technological lead for the foreseeable future, where the target is unlikely to be able to produce or source a substitute, and around which we can build a coalition. And all of those sound roughly right, and we've tried to stay true to those in this administration, believe it or not, we have. But the precise calibration of how to use these tools, I would say it's much more empirical than ideological. Like, take tariffs. The optimal level and scope of tariffs, I think it depends in large part, if you're interested in revitalizing our productive capacity, then it depends on the pace at which we and our allies can scale productive capacity in a given sector. It depends on the extent to which the private sector is willing to multiply our public investments. It depends on how other countries respond with affirmative measures or restrictive measures of their own. So again, this is multiplayer, multi-stage game theory. We have choices to make. So does China. So do aligned countries and non-aligned countries. And so we've got to, I would say, the most important thing as we conduct economic statecraft in this era of intensified geopolitical competition is we need to have humility, and we need to be nimble enough to recalibrate based on a simulation of whether we're going to be net better off 5 or 10 steps down the line. And that's going to require a lot more analytical muscle than we have right now. Thank you.
I hope that people are thinking about guardrails and what are the appropriate points of demarcation. Okay, we We both had the pleasure to work for a smart, talented, wonderful Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew. Um, so in his final speech, he warned against overuse of financial sanctions, viewing overuse as a threat to the global financial system and dollar dominance and our role in the international monetary system. Um, so that's one point on sanctions. Then the other, you mentioned earlier your role in the freezing of the Russian oligarch and central bank assets. Huge praise to you. Huge praise for the administration yesterday with respect to Gazprom Bank. Um, but the use of financial sanctions has gone far beyond Russia. So basically, maybe you can tell me whether, in a reflective moment, you think Jack was right, and has America heeded his warnings? And since you've been such an active person in the Russia sanctions, I kind of was not of the view that they were going to crash the Russian economy, but I think the Russian economy, because of the war and because of the financial sanctions, is going to be degraded and harmed for a long, long time. Any thoughts on that as well?
Sure. Like you, Mark, I have great admiration and respect for Jack Lew. He was absolutely right then, and I think his advice has aged well. We have more work to do to heed his warnings. I've sort of answered that question in part in terms of why we need a doctrine of economic statecraft. That I think borrows from where Jack was going. But look, we have to do more work in terms of articulating limiting principles for why, how, when, and to what extent we use sanctions. But second, if we really want to prevent overreach, and if we want to give comfort to the rest of the world that we're not firing these economic weapons in a way that's arbitrary or reflexive, then we really have to figure out how do we change bureaucratic practice, which is much harder than writing down guiding principles and rules of engagement. So, I mean, we have to force a proposal to sanction a target to meet a test. First of all, what is the geopolitical objective? Is it to deter action by a target? Is it to degrade their capabilities over time? Is it to impose costs as an end to themselves? Is it to change the calculus of the target? Is it to serve as a bargaining chip? Or what is it? I mean, the objective needs to be clearly stated and realistically achieved. And then what is the anticipated impact, from the sanctions measure that's being proposed? What's the likely influence on the target's behavior? What are the countermeasures that target is likely to put in place? And then how do the benefits in terms of changing the target's behavior, how do they compare to the economic costs and risks that are inevitable from taking the action? Again, relative to the next best policy alternative, because policy is all about trade-offs. And then we should always ask, I mean, can we plausibly coordinate these measures with like-minded allies and partners? If we can't, what's the efficacy going to be of acting unilaterally or with secondary sanctions? And then do we actually have flexibility? Can we ratchet the sanctions higher or lower depending on the target's response and the impact that we delivered? Because there's always an uncertainty band around the projected impact. And then, are these sanctions sustainable for the US economy, for the global economy? Not just in terms of the proximate effects, but your question was really hinting at the second order effects. What is the impact to the US role in the global financial system and the primacy of the dollar? And then I think ultimately, most fundamentally, and it goes back to the first point, is the sanctions effort embedded in a coherent foreign policy strategy that's getting reinforced through military and diplomatic channels? So if I apply all of that to the Russia sanctions regime, I know there are many critics who say they haven't done anything to drive Putin out of Ukraine. But that was never really a realistic objective. We're talking about an autocrat that's hell-bent on an 18th century czarist land grab, no matter the economic or human consequences. So we've always said sanctions are they're one tool as part of a broader strategy centered around our military support to change the calculus of Putin, to convince him that time is not on his side for continuing a senseless war. And look, this is not the, I did actually, Mark, at one point, 2+ years ago, go on camera and say, Russia's headed for a nosedive. And in fact, Russia has rebounded, but I would not characterize this rebound as resilience. He's propped up the economy in the short term by sacrificing its long-term potential. That's what capital controls do. That's what the weaponization of energy supply does. And that's what turbocharging government spending to the highest levels of the post-Soviet era to fuel the war machine is also contributing towards. I mean, if you look at the share of government spending in Russia on national security and the war effort, and you look at the multiples that it has increased, and you put that into comparison with the freezing of spending on infrastructure and education and social services, you see where this economy is headed. I mean, it already has nosebleed inflation, 9%. It already has record high policy rates, 21%. And so, look, I put it all together and say reasonable people can and should critique what we've done to impact Russia's economy in the short run, but there's no doubt that the outlook is bleak. When you have over 1,000 multinational companies that have quit Russia, when you have more than 1 million of Russia's own people that have fled, when you're shut out of global financial markets, when you're cut off from cutting edge technology, when you've lost more than half of your energy customers, you're headed for an economy that has less talent, less capital, less technology, and therefore less potential to grow. And I would just take it straight from Putin. In every single one of his so-called peace offerings, one of his top demands is to have the West lift all sanctions. And he knows it's because the sanctions regime is sapping his most essential sources of power. They're breaking his social contract with the Russian people. He said, decades ago, I'm going to take away your freedom. In exchange, I'm going to give you prosperity. And really, sadly, tragically, he's not done that. This is going to be a smaller, weaker, less sophisticated economy for a generation, and that's his legacy.
I 1,000% agree. And again, I commend you on your role in pursuing sanctions against Russia. All right, let me turn to two more questions, and hopefully we'll get to audience questions. Okay, U.S.-China discussions. We used to have extensive engagement. They quieted under the Trump administration. They've come back to some degree under the Biden administration. I think it's extremely wise that we be talking to them, whether we like them or not, because the two of us account for 40% of global GDP, which is pretty systemic. Relations are frosty. Janet Yellen and Jake Sullivan have emphasized we should cooperate where we can and compete where we must. The Chinese, as you alluded to earlier, basically feel the U.S. is trying to keep its economic rise down. Meanwhile, as you also alluded, we have legitimate concerns about overcapacity and trade surpluses and things of that nature. So how do you see this period of U.S.-China relations and the tenor of them on the economic side?
I think it's going to remain challenging, Mark. I mean, there's just a loud and bipartisan consensus in Washington in terms of diagnosis that, number one, President Xi's ambition is to restore China's hegemony, at least in the Indo-Pacific, probably well beyond. I mean, just look at the deals that were inked by China last week in South America. Second, that President Xi is seeking dominance primarily through economic and technological primacy. And three, that the US in particular, but democracies more generally, are in inexorable decline due to our social cleavages, due to our fiscal profligacy, most of all, due to our political dysfunction. And four, that he is willing to take tactical risks to realize his strategic ambition. So, Deng's mantra of hide your strength, bide your time, that's out. Geopolitical muscle flexing is in. So if you take that diagnosis as a given, and that really is the loud consensus here in DC, as you know, then it follows that China's economic model will become increasingly state-led and centralized. In other words, the trend line is not going to change over time because market-oriented reforms require a loss of control that President Xi is both unwilling and unable to accept. And that just means that China's growth strategy is going to remain underpinned by SOEs and national champions that rely on heavy government subsidies, discriminatory regulations, a whole range of non-tariff barriers and market distortions that are aimed to generate an edge. And the problem right now, you mentioned overcapacity, is that based upon these distortions and this manner of competing, China's flooding strategic sectors with supply well beyond what global demand could plausibly absorb, and therefore undercutting the competition. It's not a new problem. We've seen China run this play for decades now, to gain dominance in steel and solar, wind, medical devices, machine tools. It's just that the trend is now broadening and intensifying into batteries and EVs and semiconductors, where we're actually making hundreds of billions of dollars of investments ourselves. And remember, the starting point, China already accounts for 30% of global manufacturing in value-added terms. So what we say to counterparts and to China directly is it'd be one thing if China's growing market share in these sectors was the result of indigenous innovation and market forces. If that was the case, we should applaud it and the positive spillovers that would accrue. But if China is continuing to compete with, very cheap credit, cheap land, dirty energy, uneven regulations, in some cases forced labor, well, that massively distorts the competition, and we can see it. We can see it in metrics that we are discussing together. I mean, you can see it in volume-based metrics, domestic production trajectory relative to global demand. You can see it in falling capacity utilization rates. You can see it in nominal variables. You see a steep downward trajectory of domestic and export prices. You see it in financial measures, persistent losses from a large share of leading Chinese producers and exporters. And you can see it in the quantum of policy distortions. Many third parties have tried to quantify it. So that's the competitive landscape. And, we can't just pretend we're in the 1990s and compete with laissez-faire competition. That would put American businesses in an unfair competition against the Chinese government. And we've seen the costs of doing so, to our production capacity, to our technological preeminence, to our inequality, and I would argue to our political economy itself, to democracy. So our approach, we've tried to have a balanced approach that's not defensive or punitive. It's been number one, let's invest in strengthening our own productive capacity in R&D and infrastructure and technology, and try to grow the size and skills of our labor force. More than anything else, that's the first prong that matters. But second, partnerships abroad. So with countries playing by the same rules, let's give each other access to our productive capacity and our purchasing power. But then three, and again, regrettably, we'll have to use restrictive tools like targeted tariffs with trading partners that are not playing by the same rules, to prevent our investments from getting undercut, because the cost of standing aside and doing nothing is unacceptable. And yes, we want to do this, the restrictive measures, carefully, precisely. We don't want to dull the incentives for innovation in the US or anywhere else. And we don't want to cede the entirety of overseas markets to competitors that are not putting on controls. But look, Mark, maybe the way I can summarize our approach, or the way I think of it, is our strategy with China has not been punitive. It's not been meant to be defensive or to raise revenues. It's to change the terms of the competition in a way that is fair, on the ability to attract ideas and investment and talent, on our capacity to innovate through creating knowledge, through taking risks, through entrepreneurship, through the depth and breadth of our alliances and our partnerships. I think if we're competing on those terms, we should be confident. I very much like our chances. And that's a vision I think other countries can buy into.
Since an audience member has asked this question, I just throw it your way on this topic, fretfully. But any thoughts on the RMB and how it plays into what you just described?
Well, that kind of requires me to speculate on the next administration's policies, but I would just say, if we're headed for a world of across the board indiscriminate tariffs, it's not unreasonable to expect a currency offset.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, you focused on the model, and the exchange rate is somewhat derivative of the model, but the exchange rate reflects a lot of complex forces in global financial markets these days. So China has pulled back from Belt and Road lending after a few hiccups, but is still a huge global presence in emerging markets and LICs, low-income countries. Um, we've rightly criticized the scope and opacity of Chinese lending, but the U.S. presence in emerging markets and low-income countries is seen as lagging behind. You focused earlier in your remarks about freeing up MDB resources for these countries, um, but um, but as we see BRICS holding summits, the greater focus on the global South and observe China's large footprint, does the U.S. need to step up and increase its resources for development aid? Um, and is that even possible given our fiscal mess? And okay, I'm going to throw a wild card question at you because you started off with this new three-part approach you have talking about liquidity, but um, more liquidity means more debt. And my view is that a lot of these countries just need debt relief. The amount of debt distress in Africa and elsewhere, and some of the low middle income countries, is enormous. And I worry that giving them more liquidity is going to leave them with more indebtedness down the road. But anyway, so I couldn't restrain myself from pointing that out. You can address it, but anyway, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Mark, sure, I'll answer both questions. We do need to step up. If you accept anything I've said so far, the premise that we've returned to an era of intense geopolitical competition, not as a matter of choice, but as the reality we face, and if you accept that the competition is going to play out primarily in the theater of economics, then we have to think really hard about how to remain the leading economic power in the world. To my mind, we've got to be unsentimental about it. This is an era of economic realpolitik. And we're going to need more flexible investment and financing authorities that are capable of underwriting an affirmative vision. And it doesn't have to be purely charitable. I mean, it's one that could advance our strategic objectives in supply chain resilience and rebuilding industrial capacity and sustaining our technological preeminence and energy security, while at the same time offering the prospect of mutual economic gain with the global South, with geopolitical swing states. And the problem is right now, I believe we lack the financial firepower to underwrite this vision, even if you consider the private sector's resources, because I just don't think the private sector has the incentives to invest in many projects that have long-term time horizons to recoup the upfront investments, that have very high risks or complexities or uncertainties, or that just have very large upfront costs, particularly because there are plenty of opportunities, alternatives to generate superior risk-adjusted returns over a shorter time period for the private sector. This is the problem of short-termism. And our existing public sector authorities, in many cases, they're inadequate or inflexible to solve this problem at pace and with scale. Now, you're right, we're in a fiscal mess. And so we only have a few options to underwrite the vision I'm talking about. One is take more risk and explain to Congress and the American people why these are risks worth taking. We could sell assets, and there's a lot to say about that. We could try to earn returns on the investments that we make so that the vehicles are at least partially self-funding. Or we could find savings from elsewhere in the budget. But that last option, I think, is really hard to take seriously when 80% of our outlays are mandatory spending or interest expense, and the rest defense and non-defense discretionary. They're near 50-year lows as a percent of GDP. So, look, I think if we had more time, we would take stock of all of our bilateral tools, our multilateral institutions where we have an outsized share of voting rights, and our global alliances, and we'd assess whether these tools, authorities, and institutions should be reimagined, or whether we need to invent new tools that are more fit for purpose. For example, in the category of bilateral tools, can we make better use of sovereign loan guarantees, particularly for middle-income countries that have a relatively high credit rating and therefore a relatively low subsidy cost? Are we making the best use of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and I say that cautiously to you. Could we use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? Could it have a broader mandate to include critical minerals or refined products, and maybe have the authority to intervene in futures and options markets? Could we broaden the use of DPA Title III lending authority? Right now, we can only lend abroad to Australia and Canada. For our bilateral institutions, DFC, the alphabet soup of DFC, EXIM, USAID, TDA, MCC, is the sum greater than the individual parts? Like, if we were starting over, would we have the same institutions with these same tools? If not, how can we think about we have reauthorizations coming up for the DFC and the EXIM. The multilateral agenda, I think, has come along quite well, but can we continue to find ways to get more out of their balance sheets by taking more risk? How much risk, where they take risk, when, on what terms? So, I just think this agenda is crucially important. I think of it as bipartisan in nature, and I think we should all try to help the next administration sharpen its toolkit and do better. On your specific question, Mark, um, you're right. I mean, it's not just that there are countries with liquidity challenges for whom we would like to offer a pathway to growth. There are going to be countries that have solvency issues, and the common framework is not working. I mean, I think we need to get to a point at which we can agree for countries that apply to the common framework. There should be a debt servicing standstill. Um, the private sector should be required to participate. The DSA should be more inclusive at an earlier stage. We should really think hard about the use of state contingent instruments. We should have most favored creditor clauses. I think we should expand it to include middle income countries because the boundary itself is pretty arbitrary. But we have a collective action problem. I mean, I don't think the reason the common framework hasn't been improved is not because we don't know what to do. It's because we have a collective action problem with the largest bilateral creditor out there. And that's going to require changing that creditor's incentives. The only way to change that creditor's incentives, I think, is to have much more aggressive use of the IMF's lending into official arrears policy, getting at least a couple of debtor countries to walk away from Chinese debt if they refuse to restructure on comparable terms to the Paris Club, and then making a credible commitment to backfill the financing that those countries walk away from. And that's the third part is the hardest one, because we can't make a credible commitment to backfill for Chinese financing if we don't have the financial firepower that I've just been lamenting that we lack. So that gets South Africa can host a G20 of consequence. And whether we're going to avoid the type of geoeconomic fragmentation that I think probably most of the people on this call, Mark, would wish to avoid. But I don't have advice for South Africa because I don't know any better than any of you what is in store.
Well, thank you for that. We had slated this for 45 minutes. We're running over time. So let me just wrap up by thanking you. You've provided extraordinary service to the U.S. government and personal sacrifice through hours of hard work in your time in government. You have been an incredibly smart and articulate voice for multilateral engagement with the world. You're very convincing on that front. It's great always to see you, great to hear from you, great to hear your thoughts. Thank you to Daleep Singh for being as wonderful as you are. And, I hope we will see more chapters, interesting chapters in your life, including in official capacities.
That's all very generous, Mark, but if I've done anything well, it's because I had mentors like you. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you.